On the night of December 29th, 1792, goddamn right away, messing up. Alrighty, on the night of December 29th, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was bound for Miami, Florida. It was an ordinary flight on an ordinary evening, but by the time the night ended, 101 lives would be lost, and a legacy of mystery and tragedy would begin. This is a story of Eastern Flight 401, a crash that not only changed aviation, but also left behind something more. Welcome to Beneath the Shadows, where we explore the dark and mysterious events that have baffled investigators and chilled us to the bone. I'm your host, Travis Fenn, and today we're diving into the story of Eastern Flight 401, a case that's part tragedy and a touch bit of paranormal intrigue, just to top it off. Before we get started, make sure you subscribe and follow the show on Instagram and TikTok. Be sure to check out Patreon as well. And hell, if you haven't rated the show yet, please go over and give a rating and review. Tell me what your favorite kind of coffee is. I'm drinking some right now, and I would love to hear from you. So if you're going to review, tell me something about yourself. Tell me what you like, where you like to get your coffee, or what your favorite kind of coffee is. Love me some coffee. If you love true crime mysteries and the supernatural, this is the episode for you, and maybe the podcast for you. Now, let's board Eastern Flight 401 and figure out what really happened that fateful night by pulling the details out from beneath the shadows. December 29th, 1972 was a typical winter day in New York City. Eastern Airlines Flight 401, a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, was scheduled to fly from John F. Kennedy International Airport to Miami, Florida. I don't know why I have the airport and then the name, I don't know. It was the height of the travel season, the holiday travel season, and passengers aboard the flight were a mix of families, business travelers, and vacationers heading south to escape the cold of the Northeast. The aircraft itself, the L-1011, was a marvel of modern aviation, a wide-body jet designed to offer both comfort and safety. Eastern Airlines had only recently added the L-1011 to its fleet, and it was equipped with state-of-the-art technology for its time. Passengers of Flight 401 would have marveled at the spacious cabin, complete with the 2 aisles and wide seats, designed to make the roughly 3-hour journey to Miami as comfortable as possible. The crew on board that evening was experienced and highly skilled. The crew consisted of pilots, the captain, Robert Albin Loft, First Officer Albert John Stockstill, and Second Officer Donald Lewis Repo. It's R-E-P-O. It might be Repo, but I think it's Repo. And then flight attendants, there was Pat Gillis, Trudy Smith, Adrian Hamilton, Mercy Ruiz, Sue Tebbs, Dottie Warnock, Beverly Raposa, Stephanie Stanek, Patty George, and Sharon Transu. Captain Robert Loft, a seasoned veteran with over 30 years of flight experience, was at the helm. He was well respected with Eastern Airlines and had logged over 29,000 flight hours. Fucking crazy. That's like 10,000 flights. Probably a little bit less than that, but he's probably done a good 8 to 10,000 flights. And that's just actually on the job, not training or nothing. That's wild. Assisting him were First Officer Albert Stockstill and Second Officer Don Repo, both of whom were equally competent and trusted by their colleagues. Their flight attendants were the ladies that I listed. I don't want to list 8 names again. Pat, Trudy, Adrian, Mercy, Sue, Dottie, Beverly, Stephanie, Patty, and Sharon. Additionally, a deadheading pilot, Warren Terry, rode along to reach his next destination, and a maintenance supervisor from Eastern Airlines, Angelo Donadio, was in the cockpit as well. Together, the flight crew was more than capable of handling the night's journey. The flight had taken off without an issue at 9:20 p.m. from JFK. The weather was clear, and after reaching cruising altitude, passengers settled in for what they expected to be an uneventful flight. Some passengers dozed off, others flipped through magazines, and families talked excitedly about their plans in Miami. The mood on board was calm and relaxed. The steady hum of the Evans, the steady hum, so down. The steady hum of the engines provided a comforting background as the plane soared through the night sky. In the cockpit, the crew was equally at ease. After climbing to their cruising altitude of 20,000 feet, Captain Loft and his crew followed the standard procedures, checking instruments and monitoring the plane's progress. The plane's flight path took it along the East Coast, flying down over the Atlantic Ocean before making a final turn inland towards Miami. It was a routine flight for an experienced crew. Among the passengers, the very size of the L-1011 imposed anonymity. On Flight 401, an unexpected factor made it seem even larger than it was. Especially during the holidays, night coaches to Miami were usually filled up. This flight had been booked solid, but evidently some people had made last-minute plans, and even with 160 passengers on board, when the doors closed, 68 empty seats remained. And so they sat, strangers, some alone, some in pairs. A woman with salt and pepper hair wore a knit dress with gold frogs on her belt. Her name was Evelyn de Salazar. She managed a Manhattan art gallery. In a small crate tucked under her seat was her constant companion, her white poodle, Tina. Mark Lachey, 21, a University of Miami student, headed back to class after the holidays. Ethel Jackson, 64, a housekeeper from Liberty City, brought her white uniform in on a carry-on bag. Rose Cashman, 57, of New York, sporting a mink coat. All would be dead in a few hours. Kind of. In row 16, Gustavo and Ziamora Casado were flying to Miami to show their relatives their new baby girl. 2-month-old Christina slept in her mother's arm wearing a pink dress. Gerald Solomon, 24, was a nervous smoker who still managed to make his pack of Territons last 2 days. He had purchased a non-smoking ticket, but while on board found a seat in the last row reserved for smokers. It was a window seat on the right side, just forward of the wing. Despite that this was a pleasure trip, he was going to Miami to see a girlfriend and visit a former college roommate. He sat down and went right to work. He was a buyer for gimbals. I always knew retailing was what I wanted. I got right into it out of school, and I was pretty successful, and I got a nice salary. For a brief time, until a friend got promoted, he was the youngest buyer at gimbals. His goal in life, he would say later, was to be successful financially and live a nice, easy, comfortable life. Isn't that what we all fucking want? To that end, he had brought computer printouts on his trip to Miami. I was rotating stock that might be sitting in the store not selling. Jerry wore a gold Star of David his mother had bought him a few weeks earlier while in Israel. It was funny. She knew I didn't want to wear anything around my neck. All I wanted was a chain. And she said, "I bought this star. If you want it, wear it. Fine. If you want to hold it for your children, fine." And I said, "Mom, if it will make you happy, I'll wear it." This guy. Fucking nice guy, Gerald Solomon, doing shit for his mommy. Joseph Popson was a tired but happy soon-to-be PhD in English, returning to Florida after attending the Modern Language Association conference in New York. He settled in for the journey, digging into his paperback of The Exorcist. Great book. Great movie. Crazy movie. Exorcism's wild. Quietly, during the flight, Edward Ulrich proposed to Sandra Burt, and she accepted. This was right at the beginning of the flight. He was 44, fair-haired and balding, a man who used to play college football. She was 32, and as slight as he was large. They both lived in Seymour, Connecticut, where he was a salesman for a copper company, and she was a secretary in a bank. "I thought you'd like to see this," he said, reaching into his pocket and producing a diamond ring. She looked at the ring, smiled, and said thank you. They laughed and drank a champagne cocktail. It was ironic that the flight had more than 6 empty seats, for when they were booked, they were told that the only available seats were in the first class. Bert bought the tickets anyway. He and Sandra boarded the plane early and sat near the front in seats 4A and 4B. Directly ahead of them were a row of seats in the first-class lounge, where there were several additional empty seats and a buffet of cheese and crackers. To the right were more empty seats, and behind them, an airplane carrying 176 people. Yet Ed and Sandra were very much alone. At around 11:30 p.m., Flight 401 began its approach to Miami International Airport. The cabin crew prepared for landing, and passengers began fastening their seatbelts, collecting personal items, and preparing for the descent into the warm tropical air of South Florida. As the plane began its descent, something unexpected happened. First, Officer Stockstill attempted to lower the landing gear, but the green light that confirmed the landing gear was locked into place failed to illuminate. It was a small thing, just a light bulb, but it was enough to cause concern. Without the green indicator light, the crew couldn't be certain whether the landing gear was properly deployed. If the landing gear wasn't locked, a safe landing would be impossible. "Put that son of a bitch on autopilot here," Loft said. Stockstill complied. "See if you can get that light out," Loft told him. Captain Loft decided to circle over the Everglades while the crew tried to resolve the issue. The autopilot was engaged, keeping the plane at a steady altitude of 2,000 feet as they worked through the problem. The crew's attention turned almost entirely to this one small light. They needed to know if there was a problem with the landing gear itself or just a malfunctioning indicator bulb. In the cockpit, tensions began to rise, not because of fear or panic, but because of the focus required to troubleshoot the issue. Captain Loft instructed Stockstill to manually relower the landing gear. At the same time, there were other ways to confirm that the gear was down, and Loft chose to do one of those. He turned to Repo and said, "Hey, get down there and see if that goddamn nose wheel's down." And by down there, Loft was referring to the forward avionics bay, a space beneath the flight deck, more commonly called the hellhole. The bay was accessible through a small square trapdoor on the floor of the cockpit. Loft again turned his attention to the backup method of ensuring that the gear was down. "We can tell if that son of a bitch is down by looking through the indices," he said. "I'm sure it's down. There's no way it couldn't help but be." "I'm sure it is," Stockstill said. "It free falls down," continued Loft. "The test didn't show that the lights worked anyway," Stockstill offered, referring to Repo's test a few moments earlier. "That's right," Lofton agreed. "It's a faulty light," said Stockstill. He was still attempting to remove the light. "Bob, this son of a bitch just won't come out." "All right, leave it there," said the captain. Then Repo reappeared from the hellhole. "I don't see it down there." "Huh?" said Loft. "I don't see it," said Repo. Loft told him, "You can't see the indices for the nose wheel? Ah, there's a place in there you can look and see if they're lined up." "I know," said Repo. "A little like a telescope." "Yeah." "Well, it's not lined up." "I can't see it. It's pitch dark, and I throw the little light, I get, nothing." Loft threw a switch on the overhead panel. "Now try it." Repo went back down the ladder into the avionics bay. This time, Donadillo followed him. As Donadillo left the flight deck, he noticed that Stockstill had his right hand on the yoke and was pushing or pulling the light assembly with his left. Loft had loosened or unfastened his lap belt and was reaching across the center control pedestal, attempting to help. The captain's left arm was braced against the top of the glare shield, and he was reaching for the light with his right arm, crossing just forward of the throttles. At the airport, the approach controller looked at the altitude block list next to the little blip representing Eastern 401 on his screen. The plane was supposed to be at 2,000 feet, but the crisp, green, phosphorescent numerals read 900. The controller radioed the plane, "Eastern 401, how are things coming along out there?" Loft answered, "Okay, we'd like to turn around and come back in." And then he told Stockstill, "Clear on left." From the controller came the instruction, "Eastern 401, turn left heading 180. Loft acknowledged. 180. The L-1011 began a gradual left turn. On the radio speakers, the approach controller could be heard telling Land Chile 451 to descend to 1,500 feet. The Land Chile pilot acknowledged. "We did something to the altitude," Stockstill said. "What? We're still at 2,000, right?" "Hey, what's happening here?" At the airport, the approach controller handled another plane and looked again at the radar screen. On the screen, Flight 401's data block read CST for coast, which is shown when a beacon target is lost or becomes too weak to correlate for 3 sweeps of the radar antenna. He radioed the airliner again. And, Eastern 401, are you requesting the equipment? There was silence. Eastern 401, I've lost you. On the radar there, your transponder. What's your altitude now? Eastern 401, Miami. There was no answer. What the crew didn't realize, however, was that while they were preoccupied with the landing gear, the plane's autopilot had been accidentally disengaged. This happened when one of the crew members, possibly while adjusting themselves to check the light, brushed against the control column. The autopilot disengaged without anyone noticing, and the plane began a slow, steady descent, dropping between 200 and 250 feet per minute. It may have been slightly less than this. Between 200 and 250 is what nearly every source lists. For several minutes, no one in the cockpit noticed the subtle change. Their focus was entirely on the landing gear issue. The altitude indicators were still in view, but the crew was distracted by the light, the gear check, and the time pressure of making a safe landing at Miami. At one point, the crew joked and kept their calm demeanor, unaware that the aircraft was descending into danger. Outside the cockpit windows, the dark, featureless landscape of the Everglades stretched beneath them. It was a sea of black, no lights, no signs of civilization, just miles of swampland that gave no indications of their altitude. The plane continued to descend, unnoticed by the crew or passengers. By the time the crew finally noticed something was wrong, it was too late. In the passenger cabin, things were still calm. The lights were dimmed, and many passengers were prepared for landing. Some had already dozed off, their bodies swaying gently with the occasional turbulence. Families talked about their plans once they arrived in Miami. A few flight attendants moved down the aisles checking seatbelts, stowing away last-minute items, and reassuring passengers that they would be landing shortly. At the rear of the plane, flight attendants Mercedes Ruiz and Trudy Smith performed their final checks, making sure everyone was ready for the descent. They had no reason to believe anything was wrong. From their perspective, the flight was proceeding as planned. But passengers seated near the windows would have noticed something strange. As the plane descended, those who peered outside would have only seen darkness. The lights of Miami were nowhere to be seen, and there were no city landmarks. It was an unnerving sight, but no one suspected the danger that was about to unfold. In the final seconds before the crash, the cockpit's altitude warning alarm sounded.
Terrain, pull up.
But by then, the plane was less than 100 feet from the ground, descending rapidly towards the swamp. Captain Loft and First Officer Stockstill realized their fatal mistake too late. Stockstill, alarmed, exclaimed, "We're still at 2,000 feet, right?" But his voice betrayed the dawning horror of the situation. In those final moments, the crew's focus snapped back to the controls, but there was no time for corrective action. The aircraft, now at dangerously low altitude, plowed into the marshes of the Everglades. The impact was catastrophic. The plane hit the swamp at 227 miles per hour, tearing through the waterlogged landscape. The L-1011 airplane broke apart upon hitting the ground. First, the landing gear and underbelly ripped through the muck, followed by the fuselage splitting into sections as it skidded and crumpled across the swamp. The forward section of the plane, where the cockpit and the first-class passengers were located, bore the brunt of the crash. Many passengers in the section were killed instantly as the plane crumpled like a tin can. Seats were ripped from the floor, luggage and debris flew through the air, and the chaos inside the cabin was unimaginable. In the rear of the plane, however, the situation was different. Those seated towards the tail felt a violent jolt, but had a slightly better chance of survival. The tail section remained somewhat intact and settled into the swamp, submerged in cold, murky water. Darkness surrounded them. broken only by the flickering of small fires and sparks from the wreckage. The plane had gone down in one of the most remote areas of the Everglades. The impact spread the wreckage over a wide area, and within moments, the passengers and crew who survived found themselves in a new kind of nightmare. Trapped in the cold, murky waters of the swamp, the only light around them came from the flames of burning jet fuel. The screams of the injured pierced the silence of the Everglades. Survivors were thrown into the water, tangled in the wreckage, or pinned to their seats. It was chaos. People disoriented, struggling to comprehend the horror that had just occurred. The swamp became an immediate threat as well, with jagged metal, debris, and the potential danger of alligators and snakes lurking in the water. Those who survived the initial impact now had to fight for their lives all over again. Despite the remote and unforgiving location of the crash site, help was on the way faster than anyone could have expected. About 20 miles west of the Miami International Airport, the plane had gone down in one of the most isolated areas of the Everglades, a place accessible only by airboat or helicopter. There is technically a single road we'll talk about. Fortunately, local airboat operators who were out on the water that night heard and saw the crash and immediately radioed for help. It was these brave men, familiar with the swamp's difficult terrain, who had become the first responders to this horrific aviation disaster. Robert Marquis and a friend rowed an airboat through the dark expanse of the swamp, gigging frogs. So they're catching some frogs. He had built the airboat, registered as FL1785, himself a few years earlier. "As far as I'm concerned, there's nothing like it," he said. "There's not a prettier place you can go to get away from people." The moon had set at 1:12 that afternoon, and a half a mile high, a few clouds plumed in frosty trails. The airboat tunneled through the darkness, its path picked out by a light that Marquis wore on his head, like a coal miner's headlamp. He had fashioned the lamp himself, and kept his head turned slightly to the right. He was looking for bullfrogs to catch. Marquis navigated through the dark swamp by little more than dead reckoning and experience. By 11:40 p.m., Marquis and his friend had caught about 30 pounds of frogs. He had been working his way east toward the glow of Miami, and now he pulled back on the steering stick and turned the boat north, then a little northwest. Marquis then noticed the lights of a large jet. The plane was flying west, and it seemed very close. Although he couldn't hear the jet over the roar of the airboat's motor, he knew it was very close. Could tell it was very close. He could see the strobe lights flashing on the ends of the wings. Moments later, he saw a ball of fire, an orange glow that lit up and spread out for about 8,000 feet across the Everglades. Looked like maybe it went up 100 feet high, just for a short duration of 8 or 10 seconds. He yelled to his friend, Rayburn Dickinson, "That was a plane crash, wasn't it?" "Yeah, looked like it." Marquis put his foot on the throttle and started darting across the swamp in the blackness towards where he had seen the flash. When they reached the crash site, what they found was a scene of devastation. The wreckage was spread across a quarter mile of swamp, and fires were still smoldering in parts of the aircraft. Survivors were scattered in and around the water, and some of them were too injured to move. The airboat operators began the process of pulling survivors from the wreckage, moving them onto their boats, and doing what they could to keep them alive until more help arrived. Drenched in jet fuel, 25-year-old flight attendant Beverly Raposa struggled to free herself from her jump seat and piles of debris. She crawled through the darkness and muck and found fellow flight attendant Mercy Ruiz, who had been hurled from the plane. Bleeding from the forehead, she was still strapped to her seat. "What's happened, Beverly?" Ruiz asked, confused. "Honey, we crashed." "No, we didn't crash, Beverly. It was a bad dream. We're going to wake up." "No, Mercy. We're down." Dazed, but undaunted, Beverly brushed the mud off her wing's uniform pin and started to rally passengers who had survived the crash. She shouted into the darkness, "If you can hear me, come towards my voice. I'm a stewardess." Someone was looking for a child, and she tried to help, but found that she could not. You could just barely move. You fell over the metal pieces and the sawgrass, and it was hard to move around. I tried to get off the hunk of fuselage we were on, and it was just impossible to move. You sank, and you fell, and you cut yourself even more. I think personally, I was just as frightened as anyone else, and I knew the possibilities, but these were my people. They were my responsibility, and this was my job as a flight attendant. Also, my my voices are terrible. You don't have to tell me that. There's a lot of people in this one, a lot of quotes, so I'm trying to do different voices for them, and I know they're bad. To keep them from shock and panic, at her initiative, she started the little group of survivors in rounds of Christmas carols. They did very well until they tried to sing Frosty the Snowman, and no one could remember the words, which is kind of funny. Very, very brave person. Beverly was definitely a brave one this night. Emergency units descended on the scene. The choppers hovered over the crash, using their searchlights to illuminate the area, and emergency workers descended by rope to reach the survivors. Medical personnel began treating the injured right there in the swamp, stabilizing those who were still alive and pulling them from the water. Survivors were airlifted to any of several hospitals around Miami, selected by their proximity to the crash site. Palmetto was the closest, and it had a helipad. Hialeah Hospital was also close, but when the helicopter pilots complained that the helipad was difficult to fly to because of the clutter of power lines around it, police cars marked an alternate landing site in the parking lot of the Hialeah racetrack. Both hospitals received 6 helicopter loads of survivors, 32 people in all. Mercy Hospital received 4 flights. The first survivor handed down from a helicopter at Mercy Hospital was Evelyn de Salazar's white poodle, Tina. But the swamp itself was a dangerous place. The mud was thick and treacherous, and some of the survivors were trapped in the water, caught in the wreckage, or tangled in their seatbelts. Rescue workers waded through the muck, often up to their knees, to reach the injured. Despite the incredible efforts, not everyone could be saved, and like I had mentioned earlier, there's definitely some alligators and fucking snakes lurking around the swamp somewhere. Maybe they scurried away when the plane went down due to the violence, the noise, the pollution that it caused. But my first thought when I read a lot of these articles was that not fucking one of them really mentioned that there's alligators and snakes in this fucking swamp that they have to worry about also. Terrifying. By the morning time, the rescue operation was coming to a close. Of the 176 people on board Flight 401, 75 survived the crash. But many of them would live with the scars, both physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives. The final death toll was 101, including Captain Loft and First Officer Stockstill. Among the dead were passengers and crew alike, some of whom had heroically helped others during the crash despite their own injuries. Flight attendants like Mercedes Ruiz, who despite suffering severe injuries, worked to calm passengers and help them escape the wreckage. And then there was Second Officer Don Repo, who, according to some survivors, continued to help after the crash. Repo had been severely injured in the impact, but some claimed he guided survivors to safety in his final moments. His actions that night and his subsequent role in the supernatural stories that followed would become a central part of the eerie legacy of Flight 401. The aftermath of the crash of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was devastating. The accident claimed the lives of 101 passengers and crew members, while 75 miraculously survived to the wreckage. As the survivors were taken to hospitals and the rescue efforts wrapped up, attention quickly turned to uncovering what had gone so terribly wrong. In the days following the disaster, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, arrived on the scene. Their mission, to determine how an advanced aircraft like the Lockheed L-1011, flown by a highly experienced crew, could have crashed on what was supposed to be a routine flight. The investigation would be thorough, methodical, and ultimately reveal a chilling story of human error, technological distraction, and systematic failures in aviation procedures. They poked around the wreckage, interviewed survivors and witnesses, and pored over the flight data. When investigators climbed into the crumpled hulk of the cockpit, they found the control panel virtually intact. Loft's clock had stopped at 4:41:34 Greenwich time. Calibrating to the nearest half second, the NTSB officially listed the moment of impact at 11:42 and 12.5 seconds PM time. The airspeed needle on loft side read 198 knots. The altitude select panel was set at 2,000 feet. The nose gear light assembly was found jammed on its side and protruding a quarter inch out of its normal position. It contained 2 burnt-out bulbs. All 3 throttles were in the full forward position, another indication that the pilots discovered the problem at the last moment and tried to pull out of it. The wreckage of Flight 401 lay scattered over a vast area of the Florida Everglades, submerged in mud and water, making recovery efforts extraordinarily difficult. Investigators had to work in harsh conditions, dealing with swamps, snakes, alligators, and the unforgiving Everglades environment. But slowly, piece by piece, the story began to emerge from the wreckage. The first major clue came from the flight's cockpit voice recorder, CVR, which captured the conversations and sounds within the cockpit during the final moments of the flight. It provided a haunting insight into the last 30 minutes leading up to the crash. From the CRV, investigators learned that the crash had not been caused by a mechanical failure, bad weather, or even pilot incapacitation, but rather by a small, seemingly insignificant detail: a malfunctioning landing gear indicator light. This tiny light bulb, which failed to illuminate when the crew attempted to lower the landing gear, set off a chain of events that led to one of the deadliest aviation accidents in history at that time, U.S. history at that time. Now, though, it's not even close to one of the deadliest in U.S. history. It's like maybe number 50, somewhere around there. Captain Loft, First Officer Stockstill, and Second Officer Repo had been focused entirely on troubleshooting the problem with the light. They had turned the autopilot on while circling over the Everglades, believing that the plane was holding steady at an altitude of 2,000 feet. But the investigators found that during the efforts to fix the light, one of the crew members had accidentally nudged or pressed the control column, disengaging the autopilot and putting the aircraft into a slow, unnoticed descent. 50 seconds after reaching their assigned altitude, and when the plane was halfway through its U-turn, the captain instructed Stockstill to put the L-1011 on autopilot. For the next 80 seconds, the plane maintained level flight. Then it dropped 100 feet, and then again flew level for 2 minutes, after which it began a descent so gradual that it could not be perceived by the crew. In the next 70 seconds, the plane only lost 250 feet, but this was enough to trigger the altitude warning C-chord chime, which is clearly heard on the CVR tapes. During the NTSB hearings, one Eastern captain testified that the modern aircraft like the L-1011, having so many clicks, clacks, and bells, that the environment became filled with alert tones. There should only be a warning when a warning need be, not when everything is okay, he noted. So it is possible that the soft, short audio alert went unnoticed in the din of the cockpit noise. For whatever reason, there was no indication on Flight 401's CVR recording that the pilots heard the chime. The crew continued to be absorbed in trying to figure out whether the landing gear was properly deployed, unaware that the plane was losing altitude. The CVR revealed their conversations, which were focused on the light bulb and the landing gear problem, rather than their altitude or flight path. The final, devastating piece of the puzzle came when the NTSB analyzed the Flight Data Recorder, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, JK, which confirmed that the autopilot had indeed been disengaged and that the plane had descended from 2,000 feet to below 100 feet without any corrective action from the crew. It was only in the final seconds, when the ground proximity warning system began to sound alarms, that the crew realized that they were about to crash. But by then, it was far too late to recover. The saddest part to me about all of this is that the landing gear was, in fact, found to be down and in the locked position. It was all such a preventable tragedy. The official cause of the crash, as determined by the NTSB, was pilot error. The crew had allowed themselves to become distracted by the malfunctioning light and failed to notice the plane's slow descent. The investigation also pointed to the systematic issues within the airline industry, such as inadequate training and cockpit protocols that allowed for such distractions to occur in the first place. But the NTSB report didn't end with just identifying human error. It also made several recommendations that would change the face of aviation safety. Among these was the need for better crew resource management, CRM protocols, which emphasize teamwork, communication, and task delegation among flight crews to ensure that pilots never lose sight of the critical task of flying the aircraft, even in the midst of troubleshooting or emergencies. The crash of Flight 401 became a catalyst for sweeping changes in the aviation industry. Airlines around the world adopted stronger CRM training, ensuring that pilots and crew members shared responsibilities more effectively and always prioritized flight safety over secondary issues. This would prevent future accidents caused by similar distractions. In addition, technological changes were made to the future aircraft. One of the most significant was to redesign the autopilot systems, which would be equipped with more fail-safes and clearer alerts to prevent accidental disengagement. These changes, born from the tragedy of Flight 401, have undoubtedly saved countless lives in the years since. It didn't take long after the crash of Flight 401 for strange reports to begin circulating among Eastern Airlines crew members. The tales began innocuously enough, flight attendants talking about hearing strange noises in empty galleys, or passengers reporting an odd feeling in certain parts of the plane, but soon these reports took a chilling turn. Flight attendants talking about hearing strange noises in empty galleys, or passengers reporting an odd feeling in certain parts of the plane. But soon, these reports took a chilling turn. People started seeing things, and not just any things, apparitions, ghostly figures, and shadows that looked like people who were no longer alive. The first reports came from Eastern Airlines employees, many of whom flew on planes that had been fitted with parts salvaged from the wreckage of Flight 401. These planes were put back into service, but soon after, crew members began encountering the unexplainable. One of the most common stories involved a flight attendant who was preparing for takeoff on a routine flight to Miami. She was checking the passenger cabin when she saw a man in a pilot's uniform seated quietly in one of the rows. Thinking he was one of the flight crew, she asked him if he needed anything, but the man didn't respond. When she turned to look again, he was gone. She was convinced she had seen Captain Robert Loft, the pilot who died in the crash of Flight 401. But it didn't stop there. More and more crew members reported seeing the ghostly figure of Captain Loft in the cockpit, wandering the aisles, or standing near the galley. These sights were often brief, a quick glimpse of a man in a uniform who vanished moments later. But they left the witnesses shaken. Second Officer Don Repo was also seen, often in the same circumstances. One story involved an Eastern Airlines flight where Repo's ghost was spotted by multiple crew members. In one particularly eerie account, a flight attendant claimed she saw his face staring back at her from inside a galley oven door. Startled, she told a colleague, and when they checked again, the face had disappeared. But the flight attendants were so unnerved that they insisted the oven be inspected. To their shock, a mechanical issue was found that could have caused a serious problem during the flight. It was as if Repo's ghost was still watching over the planes, warning the crew of danger. These stories spread quickly. Eastern Airlines employees, passengers, and even pilots began reporting their own encounters with ghosts of Flight 401. Some believed it was the spirits of Loft and Repo returning to complete unfinished business. Others thought it was something darker, perhaps a residual energy left behind from the trauma of the crash. Whatever the cause, the sightings continued and the legend grew. Eventually, Eastern Airlines, hoping to avoid any further negative press, quietly removed all the parts salvaged from Flight 401. But even then, the sightings didn't stop entirely. The ghostly figures of Captain Loft and Don Repo still haunted the airliners for years to come. The legend of the ghosts of Flight 401 had already taken on a life of its own. While the crash of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 led to important advancements in aviation safety, its legacy goes far beyond the technical changes and procedural reforms. The story reforms? Reforms? I don't know. The story of Flight 401 has also taken on a life of its own in pop culture and the supernatural lore of aviation. One of the most enduring and eerie aspects of Flight 401's legacy is the series of ghost stories that began to surface in the years following the crash. And these stories weren't just told by passengers or conspiracy theorists. They would come from credible sources, pilots, flight attendants, and other crew members who swore they had encountered something otherworldly on Eastern Airline planes. The ghost stories began when Eastern Airlines salvaged parts from the wreckage of 401 and reused them in other L-1011 aircrafts. At the time, this was standard practice. Reusable parts from a crashed aircraft could be inspected, repaired if necessary, and installed in other planes to save costs. But as these parts found their way into new aircraft, strange things began to happen. Flight attendants, passengers, and even pilots reported seeing ghostly apparitions. Most commonly were the sightings of Captain Loft and Second Officer Don Repo, both of whom had died in the crash. The sightings were disturbingly consistent. Captain Loft was often seen sitting in the cockpit or in a passenger seat, dressed in his full pilot's uniform. He would sit quickly, not speaking, and when someone would try to approach him or try to interact, he would simply vanish. Second Officer Repo's ghost was also frequently reported. One of the most famous stories involved a flight where Repo was seen by a flight attendant inspecting the equipment in the galley. His ghost reportedly warned the crew of a mechanical problem, like I had mentioned, an issue that, when investigated, turned out to be real. Many people believe Repo's spirit was continuing to watch over Eastern Airlines planes, protecting passengers from further incidents. These stories became so widespread and so well documented that they even gained significant media attention. Eastern Airlines, desperate to avoid negative press, quietly removed all the parts salvaged from 401's wreckage. Yet, even after the parts were removed, the stories persisted for years. The apparitions of Loft and Repo became part of aviation folklore. The crash of 401 remains one of the most famous ghost stories in airline history. Some have speculated that the ghostly sightings are manifestations of the intense emotional energy left behind by the disaster. Others suggest it was a way for survivors and witnesses to cope with the trauma of the crash. Regardless of the explanation, the ghost stories of Flight 401 became so well known that they inspired books, documentaries, and even a 1978 made-for-movie TV, The Ghost of Flight 401. But the legacy of Flight 401 isn't just about ghost stories or the supernatural. For the survivors, the families of the lost, and the aviation industry as a whole, the crash remains a stark reminder of the importance of vigilance, teamwork, and constant improvement in safety protocols. Many of the survivors struggled with trauma for years, and some became advocates for aviation safety. In the years that followed, Eastern Airlines would continue to operate, but the crash of Flight 401 left an indelible mark on the company's reputation. The airline itself ceased operations in 1991, though many believe the crash and its aftermath contributed to the slow decline of what was once one of America's leading airlines. Additionally, in 2022, for the 50th anniversary of the crash, relentless efforts from survivors finally climaxed with the dedication of a memorial to the 101 people who lost their lives on Flight 401. Today, the story of Flight 401 lives on, not just in the hearts and minds of those who were directly affected, but in the lasting impact it had on the world of aviation. The lessons learned from that dark night over the Everglades have made flying safer for us all, and the spirits of Flight 401, whether real or imagined, serve as a haunting reminder of how close disaster can be, even in the most advanced machines. The legacy of Flight 401 is one of tragedy, but also of resilience, change, and a deep respect for the human lives that were lost. Whether remembered for its ghosts or for the lives it helped save through its improved safety measures, Flight 401 has earned its place in history, both in aviation and in the realm of the unknown. Do you believe in ghosts? Do you think ghosts are real? Do you have any belief that there is something else out there that we cannot see that lurks in another realm, or maybe in our area, in our space as well, but something that we cannot see? Maybe we can feel, maybe we can hear, maybe we can occasionally see if we're in the right space or mind or in the right energy. Do you believe in any of this? I kind of do sometimes. I don't know. Depends. As we bring this episode to a close, it's important to reflect on the tragedy of Eastern Airlines Flight 401, not just as an event, but as a story with many layers. The crash was a heartbreaking disaster that left a profound mark on aviation history. but it's also a cautionary tale about the fragility of human life, the fallibility of even the most advanced technology, and the importance of learning from mistakes, especially when the cost is so great. In the end, Flight 401 didn't crash because of a major mechanical failure or a catastrophic weather event. It crashed because of a momentary lapse in attention caused by something as small as a light bulb. A reminder of how critical it is for those responsible for our safety to remain vigilant, even when faced with minor, seemingly insignificant problems. So you fucking pilots out there better be paying attention when you're flying, especially the planes I'm on. Sick of goddamn bullshit. Don't want to crash on a fucking plane. No sleeping, no fucking doing anything that fucking distracts you from just flying. You're 30,000 feet in the air, fly the fucking plane. Don't get distracted. Can't believe there's actually been pilots that fell asleep and overflew their fucking destination. Just absurd to me. Among many other things that pilots do in the air that is fucked up and weird. We must remember the crew of Flight 401, Captain Loft, First Officer Stockstill, and Second Officer Repo were highly experienced professionals who had safely navigated the skies many times before, and yet, in the complex, high-stakes environment of the cockpit, it took only one moment of distraction for disaster to strike. Their story is a sobering example of how quickly things can go wrong, even in the hands of experts. But from the tragedy came vital lessons. The changes in aviation safety protocols, particularly in introduction of CRM, crew resource management, have revolutionized how flight crews work together. By emphasizing communication, teamwork, and shared responsibilities in the cockpit, CRM has been credited with preventing numerous accidents and saving countless lives. The haunting loss of Flight 401 was not in vain. It spurred reforms that have made flying safer for everyone, turning the lessons learned from that night into a force for good in the aviation world. The legacy of Flight 401 also reminds us of the human stories behind the numbers. It's easy to get lost in statistics when we're talking about plane crashes, the number of victims, the causes, the survival rates. But each of the 176 people on board Flight 401 had their own story. There were families headed home after the holidays, friends going on vacation, business people traveling for work, students headed back to college, and crew members doing their jobs. For the survivors, the night of December 29, 1972 was a turning point that would shape their lives forever. Some were left with physical scars, others with the emotional trauma of losing loved ones or the haunting memory of the crash itself. Many of them later became advocates for safety, using their painful experiences to push for reforms and ensure that no other families would have to endure the same heartbreak. In the aviation world, Flight 401 also left behind a different kind of legacy, a supernatural one. The ghost stories surrounding the crash are perhaps one of the most unusual aspects of this tragedy, blurring the lines between reality and myth. Whether or not you believe in the ghostly apparitions reported by crew members and passengers in the years following the crash, the stories are a reminder of how deeply Flight 401 impacted those who were close to it. The sightings of Captain Loft and Don Repo became part of aviation folklore, a testament to the emotional resonance of this disaster. But beyond the ghost stories and the reforms, there's something universal in the tale of Flight 401. It's a story about the unpredictability of life, how one moment everything can seem perfectly routine, and in the next, everything changes. It reminds us of the need to cherish every day, each flight, and each moment, because we never truly know what might be around that corner. As time moves forward, the memory of Flight 401 may fade for many, but for those who were affected, whether through loss, survival, or the changes that followed, the impact remains. The crash serves as a reminder of the need for constant vigilance in the face of evolving technology, but it also speaks for the strength of the human spirit in the face of tragedy. From the heroes who helped pull survivors from the wreckage that night, to the engineers and the pilots who continue to improve safety procedures, we see how humanity's response to disaster can lead to progress and hope. So, as we close the chapter of the story of Flight 401, let us not forget the lives that were lost that night over the Florida Everglades. Let us remember the lessons we've learned, both in aviation and in life, and carry them forward as a tribute to all of those who did not make it. They are part of a legacy that continues to keep the skies safer for all of us. Also, if you head to the crash site, you may be able to find a piece of the plane, as a piece was found as recently as 2009. I know this was 15 years ago now, but still seems like you'd probably find one. And with it being such a desolate, isolated area, I would not be surprised if more still linger to this day. With all the tragic information now presented, though, and before we end with our final takeaways, let's take a moment to head into today's main marks. All right, main marks. Number 1. December 29th, 1972 was a typical winter day, and Eastern Airlines Flight 401, a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, was scheduled to fly from John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York to Miami, Florida. Number 2. Quietly, during the flight, Edward Ulrich proposed to Sandra Burt. She accepted. He was 44. She was 32. They would both survive the crash miraculously and would marry 2 years later in 1974. They would be married for 47 years before Ed passed away in 2021. Number 3. An indicator light would fail to light up when the landing gear was initially put into position. This small detail would lead to the conglomeration of errors that doomed Flight 401. Number 4. 101 people would die as a result of the Eastern Airlines crash into the Everglades on December 29th, 1972. Number 5. Ghosts, and more ghosts were sighted after the crash. Numerous plane parts were recycled and reused in active planes, and those that received the salvaged parts also received some unwanted visitors. Ghosts! I see ghosts in them hills! Eerie shadows, figures lurking about, and the full representation of Don Repo were only a few of the numerous ghost stories that surrounded this catastrophe. Number 6, a little more new info. Kind of, not entirely. If you were paying attention, you might know what I'm talking about. The first survivor handed down from a helicopter at Mercy Hospital was Evelyn de Salazar's white poodle, Tina. Evelyn de Salazar, born November 6, 1908, did not survive the crash. Fucking blows my mind. She's sitting in the seat, the poodle's in a fucking crate underneath of it, and somehow this dog survives the crash, but the lady dies. Fucking resilience. That dog's tough. Built poodle tough. Now, let's go to our final takeaways, all right? Thank you for joining me in this episode of Beneath the Shadows. It's a fucking long one. It's a crazy one, though. And remembering Flight 401 with me today. If this story moved you, or if you have thoughts or questions about what we've covered, please feel free to reach out. I'd like to also give a shout out to the author or authors of a Google Sites document that had a load of information on it about the crash that is available. It's from, I believe, survivors of the crash. There is also a message board for survivors and those curious about the crash, if anyone wants to go that route. In the meantime, let's get away from the skies, let's get back to the ground, and let's take a look forward to a tale of miraculous tactics in 2003 by a man out in the southeastern Utah wilderness who, when trapped by a boulder for numerous days, faced a decision unlike any other most will face in their lives. Aaron Ralston would have to lie with his arm pinned under an 800-pound boulder until his death, or cut his arm off entirely and make a heroic trek out from his location to his vehicle, over 7 miles away. A feat that could take hours. It's a ghastly, mesmerizing, and downright inspiring story of fight, determination, and the will to live unmatched by most. I can't wait to tell this one to you all next week here on Beneath the Shadows. But for now, please go out, rate and review the show. 5 stars helps so much. Please recommend it to your friends, your family, your dog, your cat, your fucking person that you see every single week on the side. Whoever it might be, go out, recommend it to them. And please please give me ratings and reviews. It helps so much. I appreciate it so much. Please go and follow the social media pages. There is bonus content on Patreon, Beneath the Shadows on Patreon, Beneath the Shadows Podcast on Instagram and TikTok. And there is an email address, beneaththeshadowspodcast@gmail.com. If you want to send any email updates, topic suggestions, anything of that nature, please, please, please send me some info and stuff about you guys. We'd love to know anything about anyone who hears the episodes. Just trying to grow, just trying to build. It's going very slow right now, but I fucking appreciate you guys, so thank you. Appreciate you all so much, and thank you for being here. I am your host, Travis Fenn, and this has been Beneath the Shadows. Have a wonderful day and a fantastic fucking week. Peace out, everyone.
Wow, wow, wow. Wow, wow.